This is ANTIC, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Frank Foster was one of the founders of Hybrid Arts, the company that made MIDI hardware and software, musical instrument digital interface, for the Atari 8-bit and Atari ST computers. Frank was in charge of marketing for the company. After Hybrid Arts, Frank headed the music division at Atari, where he built marketing partnerships with Tangerine Dream, Fleetwood Mac, Peter Gabriel, and other musicians. I talked with two of the other Hybrid Arts founders, Robert Moore and Paul Rother, in my previous interview. This interview took place on February 20th, 2024.
Well, I grew up in the Seattle area, in the suburbs of Seattle, and I went to went to college at Evergreen in Olympia, Washington, which was a brand new college at the time. It was the first year it opened, the Evergreen State College, and that's where I met Bob Moore. We both worked in the media loan department of the library. And the great thing about Evergreen is that we didn't have required subjects and grades and things like that. It was very kind of progressive type of education, and it allowed me to focus almost immediately after my first year on filmmaking, which had been my passion since I was like 15 years old or so. So and so Bob and I both were working in media loan, where you could actually check out Bolex or Naraflex or motion picture equipment, as well as all kinds of other media equipment. And Bob was working in the audio area, and I was more focused on the filmmaking side. Um, and there was a group of us that we kind of all knew we were going to end up in Los Angeles. One of my good friends at the time was Matt Groening, who later became the creator of The Simpsons. And he got out to LA first, and would be, Matt is just an amazing writer, more than a artist. He always said he was a doodler, not an animator, and he would send me these typewritten letters of how life was in Los Angeles, and he eventually started. He had so many friends he was writing letters to. He would Xerox these little hand-drawn comic books that he did called Life in Hell, which later became something he did with the LA Weekly and some other publications.
Sure.
But I came out to LA initially to try to get a job on the movie Tron. I interviewed at two of the four facilities that were doing the computer animation, but I was not able to get a job. I was right out of college, and production was already underway. So I ended up getting a job back in Seattle doing laser shows, and that put me on this sort of trajectory where I was doing laser shows on the road at uh, county fairs and so on, and I basically became a carny on the midway with this laser show, and eventually was able to get a job with one of the most important companies at the time, Laser Media, which was doing most of the high end entertainment laser uh, applications, for industrial shows, concerts, things like that. But when I was at Laser Media, Bob approached me and said, "Look, in a couple of years, there's going to be this new standard called MIDI, and we got to get ready for it now. And we need to start producing software." And I didn't really kind of discounted it because I was too busy with my job. But he convinced me eventually to take on the marketing. So I was working both at Laser Media and helping him run Hybrid Arts. He introduced me to Paul Rother, who was also from Washington State, and he became our initial programmer. Uh, and in the early '80s, then we came out with our first product for the Atari 800. Um, Bob and Paul designed a hardware interface, and Paul wrote the software, and we came out with our first sequencer. We were the second company in the market. There was a company in the Bay Area called Passport Designs that had a sequencer about the same time. But for that period of time, we were like the only two really doing anything with MIDI software. Um, years went by. We managed to build up the business, um, running on this game computer, uh, and we did develop a lot of relationships with musicians that were using it and so on. And then, let's see, it was about, well, 1984 when the Tremills sold Commodore computers, and the Jack Tramiel had started as a calculator company way back,
Right.
and they bought Atari from Warner Brothers when it was losing about $1 million a day for
Mm.
Warner Brothers. But Jack trimmed the company down and started to focus on this new ST line, and he basically turned it into a family business. Sam Tramiel served as the president. Leonard Tramiel headed up the R&D, and Gary Tramiel handled the business and accounting. And uh, about a year into the ST, I left Hybrid Arts and was hired at Atari to head up the marketing. Um, in 1983, when I was at Laser Media, I was hired uh, by Steve Jobs to do a rollout for a new computer called the Macintosh, and we did the lasers for that in Honolulu. And I'd seen it was my first, real exposure to Steve Jobs and to Apple, and it made a big impression on me because Jobs made this very passionate speech just before showing the 1984 commercial that Ridley Scott directed, and this was a dealer conference in Hawaii. And to roll out the Macintosh and get the excitement up with the dealers, and the excitement level was just over the top. So when I got back, and when the Mac came out in 1984, um, immediately got one of the original 180, 128K memory
Hmm.
Macs,
Yeah.
and uh, that in 1984 was really a pivotal year for computers because IBM was entering the market, Macintosh was trying to compete with them, and the Amiga was coming out from Commodore, and Jack and the Tremills were gearing up with the ST. So it was really sort of a showdown of personal computers that began at that time. Um, I remember once I was talking to Leonard Tramiel, and he told me how he looked at the interface that we had designed for the 8-bit Atari and realized that the parts needed to add MIDI to the ST design that he was working on was not that big of a deal and wouldn't add that much to the manufacturing cost. So he decided to add the MIDI interface to the ST. That ended up really affecting the computer's success, because where the Macintosh excelled and had their killer app with desktop publishing, the ST really started to develop a killer app for music. Um, and in spite of all of the odds, we were able to really get a lot of excitement and a lot of musicians that kind of flocked to the ST, and that was, not only because of the interface, but because the interface was there. There were at least a dozen developers that were developing software and applications for the ST. So there was a lot of product to choose from, and that was happening both in the United States and in Europe, especially in Germany, where the Atari became extremely popular. Uh, so at Hybrid Arts, during that time, we developed, I would say, probably about 10 or 12 different applications for the ST. Some of them, the first, the kind of the mothership was the sequencer, the MIDI track. And when we came out with 70 track, which allowed us to synchronize with time code, so which made it, kind of then it was a professional product that it could be used with video, to do soundtracks and all kinds of things like that where you needed the synchronization, but also Um, we developed software for specific synthesizers like the Yamaha DX7 synthesizer, where one of our programmers, Tom Bajoris, kind of surprised us one day when he came in with a prototype software that would not only allow you to save the patches from the synthesizer, but it would allow you to take one sound and another sound and use them as the two parents and create children from those two patches automatically. Um, and that created kind of a whole cottage industry where musicians were kind of creating these sounds and then reselling them to other musicians. We eventually came out with notation software to print out sheet music and lots of other things. But we were solely focused on the ST. So when I joined Atari, I had all that background, uh, and then I did my best to kind of fit into the culture of the Atari uh, corporation, which was pretty unique. Being a family-run organization and doing the Comdex and NAM conventions, National Association of Music Merchants conventions, and so on. It was quite an experience, to say the least.
I bet. Awesome. Um, so, all right. So, when you were at Atari, we're going to be jumping around a little bit. When you were at
Mhm.
Atari, you were leading the music division. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's right. We called it the music division.
And so, what did that mean? I mean, you're reaching out to different bands to get them interested in the Atari, or were they coming to you? Um, were you reaching out? Were you reaching out to the industry, or were you reaching out to the consumer home user?
I would say a little of both, but the professional side of the music business kind of drove the rest of the business because that was sort of where the status was, and we had musicians by that time that were coming to us. So, um, for example, Paul Hoslinger from Tangerine Dream came to us because he was already using Cubase from Steinberg with the ST in Europe with Tangerine Dream. So one of the first things we did was we sponsored their tour um, and built publicity, with the publications and whatnot through that. But uh, there was a point where I was getting calls from various pretty well known musicians, on a weekly basis in Sunnyvale, and we were just kind of catering to them as best we could. And they were helping us with publicity and so on. Uh, Things progressed more and more while I was there. I met a guy named Jimmy Hotz. Um, Jimmy was from Texas and then was working in session as a session musician with a lot of well-known musicians, but he was also pretty technically savvy. I mean, very technically savvy, and he understood MIDI. He came to us because of Hybrid Arts and our software, but he had developed a system with a touchpad system that he originally developed for Mick Fleetwood of Fleetwood Mac, where Mick could have these pressure sensitive pads on his chest, and he could play the drum machine from his chest, in a live concert situation. And Jimmy took that technology and turned it into a MIDI keyboard where you could have pressure sensitive pads and was able to automatically or to program the keyboard in such a way that it would remap the keys and keep every key in tune with the music that was being played. That was one of the applications. It was also a really good MIDI controller. So um, we made a deal with him, and Atari actually licensed that technology and started to market and sell these what we call the hotspots. They were really ahead of its time. I don't think a lot of people really understood the capabilities of it. Um, but we did an ad campaign with Mick from Fleetwood Mac, We sponsored the Fleetwood Mac tour. I even ended up going on the road with them for 2 weeks in Australia, where we were promoting with our Atari dealers. But for the ST, the music market was really our niche. And of course, the other side would be the gaming, because Atari always had the game name.
Sure.
Um, and one kind of funny thing that happened when I was at Hybrid Arts is um, this young guy came to me who was from Seattle, Michael Lee, I think his name was, and he had developed a game that was really kind of a funny game. It was it was a 3D, almost Doom kind of game, but it was, you go down these corridors and you would shoot these spherical happy faces, and the object of the game was to kill all the happy faces. Uh, but the thing that he had done is he'd figured it out so that you could network multiple Atari STs through MIDI. Now we have to remember this is way before multiplayer games were popular or even available. So and of course, to make it work, you had to physically be there and connect the MIDI cables to each of the Atari STs. But you could have like 12 of them networked, daisy chained through MIDI. And what would happen is that the user group shows, all the users groups would, they would bring all their computers in, and they would connect up, 12 systems, and all the guys would be playing against each other competitively, this game. So it became sort of a major part of user group meetings. Now there was it was totally software, and of course the problem with games and computers at the time was that things could get pirated very quickly. So we didn't make any money off of the product, but it did really have an impact, I think, on the culture of the Atari ST through all the popularity with the user groups. And it was, I think, a really important example of multiplayer gameplay before LAN networks and so on allowed you, and before the internet, for that matter, allowed you to do what we take for granted today.
Was that the first use of, as far as you know, of people using MIDI for something that was not music related or timing related at all? It was using it for a game instead. It
Right.
was pretty novel.
Yeah, I think it was pretty unique in that way. I can't really think of many applications that were using MIDI prior to that that were not a music kind of application. Um, and of course, Hybrid Arts wouldn't have been marketing and selling it had it not, been using the MIDI aspect of it, because it wouldn't have fit in with too much with our business plan. But one thing that did happen is that we also sold MIDI cables, because they weren't that readily available in the stores yet. So we did sell a lot of MIDI cables from that, which was a good thing for us.
I bet. Um, Sometime last year, I interviewed Michael Park, who programmed the Atari 8-bit version of MIDI Maze, which was never officially released, but again, it was pirated. Everyone had that. Um, and so that was interesting that you could use the older technology to talk to the STs using this common interface.
Yeah, it was kind of a cultural thing at the time with the whole community of the Atari.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's go back to the earlier 8-bit days, which we glossed over a little bit. And this is an
Sure.
8-bit podcast, so I'd like to get in some of that. So you were doing marketing for Hybrid Arts, and you're trying to sell this MIDIMate. How did that go? It seems to me that this thing, once the world knew about it, sold itself, and people who knew what it was wanted this thing. How much of it was random hobbyists? How much of it was dedicated musicians?
Um, well, there was I think probably our biggest market was sort of the higher end hobbyist, um, the person with a regular job that would want to play with their music compositions and so on the weekends and uh, that kind of thing. But we tried to focus as much as we could on the professional market. One of the reasons we pursued the SEMTI time code and so on, and allowed that to kind of seep down. We spent a lot with marketing. Most of the company resources went towards monthly ads in Keyboard Magazine and Electronic Musician Magazine. We put a lot of effort into the convention, the NAM convention, National Association of Music Merchants convention, with a booth that we would show all of our products in. It was a lot of work, and I give a lot of credit to Alan Hart, one of our other partners, and Bob, for putting a lot of effort into that. My responsibilities were really the overall uh, look of the company, the marketing of the company, and the general structure of keeping everything working day to day as the CEO of the company. Bob really was a phenomenal idea guy. Always had, amazing ideas for the next thing, and a lot of excitement working with the programmers. He really instilled a lot of energy, and we ended up with a group of about 6 or 7 programmers that he sort of provided the inspiration to. And Paul was sort of kind of the wise technical person in the background that would uh, give us a good piece of feedback here and there along the way. But the 8-bit Atari, starting the company was really um, a struggle for us. I mean, we would pay our employees, and if there was anything left at the end of the time period, we would pay ourselves a little bit. At the time, I was still working at Laser Media, so I was kind of depending on that for income. I don't know how Bob was managing, but at the early days, it was really rough, and we had to really put a lot of effort into it to get some traction. But once we did start to get a name, and then I remember Bob and Alan went to the Music Messe in Frankfurt, Germany, one of the first times with the 8-bit, and uh, it started to kind of take on with its own legs. But it was really rough at the beginning because everybody kind of laughed at us at first, because the 8-bit Atari was a game computer. It didn't have uh, a really kind of serious reputation in the market for business or for music or anything other than that market. So I can't tell you how many times that we were actually pretty much laughed at for being on that platform.
So why did you choose that platform?
Well, when during that time period, there were a bunch of our, Bob and some of our other friends. We were all gamers, into video games. So, Bob and I would go to Westwood in Los Angeles to this arcade there and, put our quarters in. And when we saw the 8-bit Atari and some of the games that were coming out for that, we all got uh, Atari 800s. And we were all playing around with our Atari 800s. And it just naturally went that since that was the computer that we had, we didn't have, a, PCs were, there was the Apple II and things like that, but there wasn't really uh, the solid kind of computers that we had later. So, uh, and Bob and Paul figured out a way to plug the interface into the 800s. So it sort of evolved from that. It wasn't like we sat down and did a market study and decided, well, we should make this on this platform. It just sort of evolved on its own, kind of out of necessity and what we had.
That makes sense. What games did you play on the Atari?
Oh man. One of my favorites was, well, that was a, you know, the graphics were so primitive back then. Um, it's hard to recall. I know that on the ST came out, one of my first favorite games on that was Sundog, which was sort of a Star Trek-y kind of game. Um, we basically played everything that was available on the 800. Uh, Not really any competitively, but just playing around, after our jobs were done for the day,
Right.
um, kind of thing. It was just
Nice.
kind of a very casual. Uh, we get together for a beer and play together on our systems sometimes, so it was fun.
So you did the 8-bit stuff. You transitioned to the STs. Um, you were that seems like a case of the right place, right time. You already knew the people, some people at Atari, and then the Atari did this amazing music machine.
I think even more importantly than we knew them, they knew us. Um, Leonard had done quite a bit, I think, of research when he was starting to design the ST. So, um, he knew about hybrid arts, uh, and he knew our hard. He had taken our hardware apart and all of that. So, um, and I think that we surprised um, the Tremills to some extent with the kind of market that we had built on the 8-bit. Because when they first took over the company, the 8-bit was still the computer that was going to the stores. So, um, and I have to say, that period of my career was really unique because, like I said, the company, the Tremills ran the company like a family business, um, and it really took some getting used to work with the kind of the personalities and the ways that things happened and being fortunate to be kind of brought into that family and to be invited into their homes and to have Thanksgiving with them and things like that gave me this sort of really interesting perspective on how this man who survived the Holocaust started a calculator company in New York and brought his family all the way into one of the top computer companies um, was really something to experience. And I was very young in my career, and I think I learned a lot about business while I was there that I would probably not have been exposed to any other way. Uh, and I have both kind of scary memories and fond memories from that time period because it was really quite unique.
Yeah, I was about to say it sounds like you're fond of the Tremills, which is fine, but I have talked to over the years many people who are just like not as fond of their business, tactics or whatnot. But sounds like you have good feelings.
Well, it's a long time ago, for one thing, so the memories can mellow out. But um, I think there was an underlying respect that I always had for them for what they were able to accomplish. Um, there's no question that Jack ruled with kind of an iron fist, and he was famous for declaring that the computer business was war, and that they would fight it as war, and they didn't take any prisoners. There was a lot of um, uh, very strong pressure to succeed, pressure to uh, get market share, and so on. Um, and I certainly felt like I was, you know, challenged every day that I worked there to do the best that I could. Um, but uh, looking back, I do have some fond memories. I have some scary memories too, where where I got in trouble for things. One time I mentioned that that the ST would have multitasking in the future, and I got in a lot of trouble for mentioning something that wasn't available yet and things like that, because you get caught up in the excitement of the moment. But uh, I would say it's a mixed memory, uh, and it did teach me a lot about uh, being fiercely competitive in a difficult market, which I think helped me later in other jobs that I went on to do in computer graphics. Um, so yeah, you're right. I have kind of both type of feelings about it, and it's not without some fondness looking back on it. To tell you the truth,
Why did you leave Hybrid Arts and go to Atari?
this was a time where at Apple, uh, Steve Jobs had brought in John Scully, and I think Bob um, was somewhat influenced by that and decided to bring in this guy from Germany named Rainer Portner, um, and have him start to take on some of the management responsibilities. And it looked to me like it was a matter of time before I was going to be in a similar situation as Steve Jobs, and that this person would take over the company, and exactly that's what happened. So when I started to see that, I said, "Well, I don't need to do this. I can." The person that was doing marketing at Atari at the time left, and I was asked to come in, and it was just sort of a natural transition. Um, but I think if I'd stayed at Hybrid Arts, I probably wouldn't have been happy. And looking back, there's always a shelf life to these kinds of businesses where the technology changes and new things come into the market. I think it wasn't more than a couple of years after I left Atari, then Atari closed down completely. So it was sort of this window in time where it gave me this opportunity to be in Sunnyvale for a while instead of in Los Angeles, where I spent almost all of my career. And I should also mention, and this takes, you know, brings it to the next level for me, that I met a lot of very interesting people during the hybrid arts and Atari time period. I met a lot of musicians. I mean, almost a who's who of musicians, one way or another. And at one point, I think kind of almost at the pinnacle of the hybrid arts um, energy, we developed a product we called ADAP, analog to digital audio processor. And this was a rack that plugged into the ST and allowed you to record digitally, edit, and play back digitally. It was the first digital audio recorder that worked with a personal computer. It was way before sound cards. So um, that product, which we did with Milford Labs, um, was a huge hit at the NAMM convention. It was one of the top. It was in the top 10 products that year at Electronic Musician Magazine, and it got a lot of attention because people who are working in a studio, like studio engineers, this was something that they could use, and you could also use it with MIDI from a keyboard and play the samples that you record. You could record a dog barking and play it from the keyboard and stuff like that. Of course, more sophisticated sounds than that. But anyway, I got contacted by one of the techs for Peter Gabriel, and I loaned him a system. And a couple years later, right after I left Atari, I was at a SIGGRAPH, the annual computer graphics conference. And the guy who I'd met through Peter Gabriel came running up to me and said he had been looking for me, that there was an R&D project over at Columbia Pictures at Sony, and that they were playing with the idea of starting a new division or taking on some of the visual effects work in-house, because at that time, TriStar had just done Terminator 2 and Hook, with Steven Spielberg, and spent a lot of money with George Lucas at ILM. So I went over to Sony, and we started talking about a concept called pre-visualization, where we would use a program. Well, I was using 3D Studio because that was a 3D program that Tom Hudson and Gary Yost from the Atari community had written for the PC.
Sure.
And I was alpha testing and beta testing the software. So we started this whole thing where we would pre-visualize the set or the location for the movie in advance and put sort of mannequin figures into the scene and allow the director to pre-visualize what the movie would look like in the computer way before they got onto the set and started spending the hundreds of thousands of dollars a day to make the movie. So when I was doing that, I got sent to Pittsburgh on a Bruce Willis film called Striking Distance, and I pre-visualized all of the chase sequences for the film. And when I came back, they said, "Look, Frank, we need to explain to Tokyo what we're doing and see if we can start up a division." So I put together a video that showed how we used this in the film and how it could be used in sort of synergistically with other parts of the Sony corporation assets. And that's how ImageWorks started. So I was the first employee at Sony Pictures ImageWorks before it was called that. And it really all came out of that one contact that I made during Hybrid Arts with Peter Gabriel's guys. So when you're doing one job, you never know what it will lead to through the networking and contacts that you have the opportunity to make. And during those years at Hybrid Arts and Atari, I made friendships that have lasted to this day with musicians, and being a filmmaker, music and audio is so important part of the filmmaking process that I really respect the idea that I spent that time doing those disciplines, because it helps me appreciate the importance of the other side of visual filmmaking, the audio part and the music part. Music, I think, is tremendously important. And not being a musician myself, I look forward to collaborating with the people who are.
Very good. Where did Hybrid Arts get its name?
Bob came up with it.
Hmm.
And I'm not exactly sure how, but it was kind of a catchy thing that he came up with. And together we designed this kind of little icon with the arrow and circle that we built as part of the logo. I selected the type font, and we made that our logo that continued throughout the whole course of the life of Hybrid Arts. And then I tried to stick with particular type fonts and styles for each of the products, using like the avant-garde typeface for the MIDI track, MIDIMate, where the M would kind of have this big slant to kind of stylize it. And in that regard, Bob and I really were able to collaborate really well. I mean, he would come up with ideas, I would bounce my ideas off of him. But to the most part, I would say, the huge portion of Hybrid Arts is personality and its look and its name and its feel and its products were the brainchild of Bob Moore. I mean, it came from him. He was the stimulus, the catalyst for every technical, every creative thing, I think, that happened with the company. And I give him a lot of credit for that.
How did your time at Atari come to an end?
Well, I mentioned that incident where I got in trouble. That was one thing. And so, and I really valued my collaboration with Leonard. And that particularly upset him because, he's the one responsible for the new technology and when it comes out. So that sort of developed a rift there, and I felt like, okay, we've kind of hit this point where I don't know really how much more I can do, and I was really itching to get back to animation because, my whole background was in computer animation and not so much the music. That was sort of my adopted uh, area that I took on, almost completely because of Bob Morse. So I decided I wanted, and I was also getting homesick for Los Angeles, believe it or not. So I decided I was going to move back, um, and Gary Yost and Tom Hudson were deep into the first version of 3D Studio. So I had to buy a PC instead of an Atari for the first time, and I was alpha testing and beta testing that software, um, which was, by the way, what I had been talking about with the guy from Peter Gabriel, that I was doing that because he came to me one time before all the stuff with Sony, and he said, "Look, Frank, Peter wants to know more about computer graphics, and I know that that's your area that you really love. Can you arrange for Peter to get to get a tour of some of the facilities?" And my other partner, Paul Rother, was working at Digital Productions, which was ran by Gary Demos and John Whitney Jr., two of the really important pioneers in computer animation and computer graphics. So we brought Peter over there, and Paul helped me tour him around the facility. And that's one of the reasons why I they came to me for the Sony project. Um, but it reminded me, doing that for Peter. It reminded me of how much I missed computer animation. So I went with no job back at LA. I just went back, quit my job at Atari, and just was took a month just working with the software with Gary Yost, and it just happened that at SIGGRAPH, that opportunity came up. If it hadn't have come up, I don't know what I would have done, but it's just happened to be, and you're young and you're early in your career. Sometimes you can take those kinds of opportunities if you don't have a family to be worried about and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, those days were really kind of adventurous times uh, in many ways. We took risks. Hybrid Arts was a risk from the day one. Uh, and we lived and breathed that risk for all the years I think that we were there.
Right, jumping way ahead, what do you do today? What do you do these days?
Well, I was at Sony for 10 years, uh, and I watched Sony ImageWorks go from a couple of people to hundreds of people, uh, and we became a real full-fledged division at Sony Pictures. Um, and that was a really an amazing experience. Sony's a phenomenal company to work for. 185,000 employees, and some of the most amazing products. And having run the PC side of ImageWorks for those years until the PC took over SGI and became only PC, like everybody else did in the industry. I had the opportunity to work with a lot of the groups in Tokyo, and that was really a lot of fun. And the Sony Vaio computer and so on. The engineers and the marketing guys in Japan would come to us a lot of times for feedback and ideas. But after 10 years there, I left to go and do my first, well, actually my second. Well, while I was at Sony, I got the opportunity from SIGGRAPH to direct a feature film called The Story of Computer Graphics. Um, in that time, SIGGRAPH had become a really big conference and was very successful, and um, had actually a little bit of money that was a surplus from the conferences, and they decided to do a documentary for the first time, and I was chosen to direct it. Um, and we spent a year and a half doing interviews. I interviewed over 80 different computer graphic pioneers. Everybody from the inventor of the mouse to, the founders of Pixar. I interviewed George Lucas, and uh, we released the film in 1999. Got Leonard Nimoy to do the narration. Paul Hossinger from Tangerine Dream did the music. So that was a huge opportunity for me to actually direct a film uh, and supervise all of its editing and everything. So when I left, when I was at Sony, after I finished that documentary, which Sony loaned me out to SIGGRAPH to do, an opportunity came up to work with the French comic book artist Mobius, Jean Girard, um, with a company in Hong Kong. They wanted to do a feature film based on his character and story. So that was too much of an opportunity to pass up, because for many of us in animation, visual effects, graphic design, comics, uh, Jean is a huge hero. I mean, Mobius, his uh, comics or graphic novels are just legendary. Uh, and he was the sweetest, nicest person to work with. Had a It was really a thrill, but it was very challenging to try to do this in Hong Kong. So, and then it got even more challenging when the investors decided that instead of spending the money to do it in Hong Kong, that we do it in mainland China. So, ended up having to build a school in Shenzhen across the border into from Hong Kong into mainland China, and from that school of about 1,000 computer animation students, selected the top 300 to work on this film. Um, Living and working in communist China, I would tell you, is something. Uh, and I'm not sure if I was really completely prepared for it. It was very difficult, um, and I ended up uh, leaving the production before it was completed. Um, and it was eventually, but it was so far along by that time that they were able to complete it without my direct supervision. But it was really an amazing uh, experience, but a very difficult one. I don't have a lot of fondness for that time period. And then I spent another several years in India, because in 1995, when I was at Sony, I had visited uh, India to give a presentation for Autodesk in Bollywood about how the Autodesk 3D Studio was being used in feature films in the United States. And I met a lot of the top directors and producers in Bollywood at that time. And later that year, I went back during Christmas vacation because I'd met this couple, Ketan Mehta and Deepa Sahi, who were a director, and actually Deepa was a very famous actress in Bollywood at the time, and they wanted to start the first computer graphics company in India. So I helped them write the business plan. That was in 1995. And so in the 2000s, they asked me to come back and help them run the company. So I spent 2 years in Mumbai, um, running a fairly large computer graphics and animation facility. Um, and again, here I get this opportunity to experience a totally different kind of culture. I mean, India is a culture where movies are almost a religious experience. I mean, you go to the movie theater in India, and before the movie starts, it would play the national anthem with the flag. It's integrated into the culture so much, and um, just being exposed to that fervor and that excitement about movies. I think most people by now know that India makes many more feature films a year than we do in the United States. So um, there's a huge amount of production activity, and there's a section in Mumbai, in Bombay, called Film City, which is this kind of park area in the middle of Mumbai. I mean, it's like the city grew around this sort of national park, and somehow they let part of the park be used for the film industry. Um, but it's literally a place where you come in through the gate, and there's a lab, and there's these various production companies and sound stages and so on. But there's also um, the poor people who live there and do the kind of work of setting and building sets and so on. They're subjected to the wildlife of the park. So there are tigers that live in the park, and every year 2 or 3 people are killed by this tiger, and it's accepted as part of the natural existence of this film studio area, which to me was like so amazing. And one day, these animators came rushing into Maya, was the name of the company, Maya Digital Studios, and and they were all like excited, and they called me over, and they showed me this picture on their phone where this hoof of a deer is sticking up, and this tiger is looking at them straight in the face. They had just gone for a walk, and they ran into a tiger while they were having their smoke break from doing animation that day. So it was just the most amazing juxtaposition of culture and the reality of a country that just lives and breathes filmmaking.
Wild.
Uh, very, very, and very, and I'm very good friends with all of those guys and gals for this very day. But in fact, right now I'm finishing up a script that's all set in India, with a producer here in Los Angeles. So, but since then, you're asking me what am I doing now? I felt like I needed to really get back to my days of, growing up as a Boy Scout. I was an Eagle Scout when I was young, growing up in the suburbs of Seattle. Um, and I bought a beachfront property in Baja. So I'm building a house right on the Sea of Cortez in outside a town called Loreto in southern Baja, and used AutoCAD for designing the house and pre-visualizing how I want it to look and everything. But for the most part, it's like fishing for yellowtail and working with the dirt and getting things ready for construction. That's what I'm doing now,
That sounds
getting
lovely.
back to the basics, kind of.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I enjoy it. I could probably put this on a serious note for kind of a conclusion here.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to talk a moment about the end of hybrid arts. Um, it did not end well. Uh, I had gone to Atari. Reiner had come in and taken over the day-to-day running of the company. Um, and being so preoccupied with the overall Atari market, I sort of ignored and I was under a lot of pressure from the other developers not to give hybrid arts uh, unfair advantage with the parent, computer company Atari, because we had, you know, probably 20 different developers all over the world that were doing something with music. Um, and then, one day, I heard from Bob that you know, the stock had been sold, and investors had taken over the company, and the company was gone. It was just like dissolved. Um, I don't know really all the specifics because I wasn't there. I had some conversations recently with Bob and Moore about it, but you know, we put all that effort into it and we didn't get anything out of it. We lost all of our investment in the company. Um, so, it gives you the kind of respect that, keep in mind, you're always have to remember that things can disappear and you best take advantage of things while you can, or try to ensure that you put things in place to prevent a bad ending. Um, but for quite a while, it was a difficult situation for me to talk with Bob about, and kind of one of those life's lessons that you hopefully walk away a little bit more educated than when you walked in.
Thank you. So there are hobbyists today that still use their Atari computers. Some of them are playing games, some of them are programming, some of them are still making music using their 8-bits and their STs. So many of us are still playing MIDIMates. uh, so if you could send a message to the people who are still using their Atari computers today, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
For those that are still having fun with their 8-bit Atari, their Atari 800s, even their Atari STs, take good care of that hardware. You know, you can't go out and buy it anymore, and there are certain things that you can't get on any other computer that you still can do on those systems. So yeah, I do know people that are still using them and still using them in their studios for MIDI. So um, take good care of them. Uh, when those RAM chips burn out, you'll have a hard time replacing it.
Thank you, Frank.
You're welcome.
Appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, please consider supporting my Patreon at patreon.com/Savitz. I've been publishing interviews like these since 2013 and would like to continue doing so for a long time, and your financial support will help. Thanks.